to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
Welcome to Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.tv. Thank you for joining me this evening. We're hearing all this, repeal Obamacare and replace it, but we don't have anything to replace it with, so it might take a few years to repeal it. We'll come up with something. And the real key issue that they're arguing is not pulling the health care from those that were able to get it because of Obamacare. But in some of those circumstances, they weren't exactly able to get it. They kind of had to force themselves to get it. Really couldn't afford it. They're already on a shoestring budget and, cutting a couple meals out of the week just to pay for something like that. I actually know someone that started doing that. And then I know plenty of people that still have not signed up. They also don't file any taxes. Kind of weird. But really, a lot of it comes down to, well, you want people still to be able to have their health care. Well, we have to have a decent economy. We have to have the decent paying jobs to be able to afford that. And then along with a strong economy comes a point where the companies are able to provide extremely better health care that many of them have had to cut because of Obamacare. So really, we really should still have a strong focus on the economy. Now, I'm kind of a critic of Trump's, plan to bring jobs back. One of them being the tariff, and there's issues with a lot of the ideas of tariffs, and I used to be a big believer in them. No longer am. I definitely have went full free market away from tariffs, and I do think that, who I decide to do business with, I shouldn't be, penalized for doing business with something or someone or another company outside of the U.S. And believe me, I'm someone that rather do business with someone in the U.S. And when you do have an economy that's booming, you're able to do that. China has been able to do that. They buy their own products. A lot of big companies that have factories in China also complain about Chinese companies creating the fakes. Well, you put your factories in China. China is not going to respect your copyright laws or your, you know, trademarks, and they're not going to respect it. So therefore, these companies that are Chinese-owned companies are allowed to produce these, and you know they'll throw a little bit of a bone to some of the big companies, but not a huge one. And again, most of these companies still will have factories over there for the main reason that it's extremely cheap labor, and we'll pay the extravagant prices here in America. Well, you know what? You have to send a message that, I want my stuff cheap, but now our wages are being brought down to the point where what you're selling them for now is out of range. But, this is a, new administration. Maybe the economy will turn around. We can cross our fingers, but I'm not for everything that Trump is proposing, and I think it can do considerable harm. But we're going to have to see what he actually does, not just what he talks about. But Ron Paul Liberty Report covered some of Trump's trade policies and will they bring jobs back home. So let's go ahead and cover this real quick.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. We want to talk about a subject that we've heard a lot of talk about in the last year or so, and that is bring jobs home.
Yeah.
One thing I've been thinking about on this issue is that I may be naive at times, but I've never met anybody in Congress who says, you know what? I don't want jobs in this country. I want to send jobs overseas. Even Bernie Sanders, he's a socialist and probably an international socialist. But when it comes to jobs at home, he's for them. Everybody wants them. Yeah. But what happens? Policies make a big difference. And right now we're talking a lot about trade policies. Trump has talked a lot about it, and even weeks, during the campaign especially, but even weeks since his nomination and election. He's having a lot of influence, and he's still talking about trade policies, and his whole goal is to get jobs back at home. Now, working on the assumption that nobody is advocating on purpose for jobs to go overseas. So what we'd like to do here is dissect it out. Well, why are the jobs going overseas, and will Trump's policy help? I think I'm going to start off by saying that, some of his stuff is good, and some of it will be very helpful, but quite frankly, the whole program I can't endorse. The part that I like is improving the business conditions in this country, allowing capital to come home without a huge tax on it, and also to lower corporate taxes, and also to reduce regulation and allow our companies to be more competitive in the world. But I think Donald Trump has a lot more to say about trade policy than just improving the conditions of people here at home by eliminating or removing restraints of government. It seems like he wants to have affirmative action, and he has to want to do special things, almost as if it's a subsidy and to encourage people to do things. And I think that's his whole goal is to control the flow of capital and where the jobs are going, and not just improving the conditions where there's a better and more prosperous free market, but to also give a pretty good shove and create incentives and punishments. That's the part that I have a little trouble with.
And we talked about this a little while ago when we talked about the carrier deal, which was one of the first interventions that Trump made, and that was just after he was elected, where he pushed Carrier to keep those jobs here. And at the time, you mentioned the carrot and the stick. You know, the carrot, of course, is the incentives, the financial incentives. But then you mentioned the stick, and it's a pretty big stick, it seems. And we've seen some of that this past week.
And I think that's existing in different forms all through this process of what Trump wants to do and not do. But, you know, with Carrier, it was United Technology. They make billions of dollars off the military in the military budget.
Yeah.
And a president, what annoys me, generally speaking, is the power of a president. Just think of Obama. Well, what's Obama going to say about the pipeline, you know, in the Midwest? And even if it has to do crossing international borders, should the president say yes or no and have complete monopoly control of this? But he does. And I think a guy like Trump will enjoy that type of authority. So it's very easy to threaten, since you have the power and the president has the power, to go to Carrier and say, hey, you know, if you don't do what we say, you're going to have a little trouble getting your contracts. And I think there's a lot of that going on right now with the car companies.
We have a tweet from GM that he tweeted about GM, and GM apparently is building some of its smaller hatchback cars in Mexico. And Trump tweeted out that they need to, and I think we have the tweet here coming up, but here it is. General Motors is sending Mexican-made model of Chevy Cruze to U.S. car dealers tax-free across the border. Make in USA or pay big border tax. That sounds pretty intimidating.
It sure is. That is about as much of a threat as you can expect. I think this whole process is a bit of danger involved here, because the danger of Keynesianism, because it always fails, is that you drift toward corporatism and fascism. And we have a lot of corporatism when you look at this kind of stuff, bailing out the big companies. Matter of fact, we'll go talk a little bit about General Motors. That's a company that was bailed out. So the big business and corporations and banking industry, the medical industry, is all a mixture. And even Obama and the Democrats go along with this. It's not socialism. Mises predicted it would become fascism or excessive corporatism, but he didn't think it would evolve into communism or a socialism that would be total government ownership. And that sort of looks like what's happening today. We're moving in that direction.
And how might, for example, say GM feels intimidated by this tweet, strangely enough, what a strange world, but it feels intimidated by this because, as you pointed out, it does have this issue of the bailouts hanging over it that Trump may try to use as leverage. What might that do to them in terms of their business decision? Might they make some bad choices based on this intimidation?
I think it absolutely will. I think, but then you have to sort out the bad choices versus the grandstanding. You know, who knows what's going to happen on Carrier? Who knows what was said behind the scenes? Well, you do this and make me look good, and we'll sort of forget this. You know, we really don't want to put Hillary in prison. You know,
yeah.
This sort of thing. But then it serves the person on one side of the bargain. He gets a boost, and of course, Carrier, you know, accommodates, and they get to keep their contracts. But later on, things will be sorted out. But I think that I think it's a bad situation, and the reason is, and the question you have is, how does it affect the decisions? Well, you know, General Motors has committed $30 billion in Mexico. Does that mean we just quit? We're going to break away and not do it? But if they're intimidated and they change their plans, it's a lot like what happened in the housing bubble. You have these mistakes. The major mistakes made in an economy like ours is that interest rates are false. They're lower than they should be. Mm-hmm. Business people make the wrong investment decisions. Consumers and savers make wrong decisions. So the interest rate is key. But then on top of that, government interferes. In the housing bubble, they had this Community Reinvestment Act that insisted they make bad decisions and bad loans. And then they have insurance programs that guarantees these things. Mm-hmm. And then they wonder why they get distortion. Well, this is an added factor. You know, we have the distortion of the interest rates of business people are tempted to make the wrong decisions. And then you have the bailouts. General Motors gets bailed out, and they anticipate things, so they sort of know that standing out there and that they might get this bailout, but they then come along and they get a little pressure, and that's just an added thing. So I would think that I think that General Motors got $30 billion special deals that. They're not a true free market company.
Yeah.
They're a government motors company. And at this rate, as long as the pressure is there for them to continue to make the wrong mistakes and to continue to get the wrong information about interest rates and finding out what consumers are doing, right now, I think the consumer are over their head in automobile debt.
Yeah.
So I think we're ripe for some real corrections there, in spite of what some of these short-term intimidations might do in cancellation of some of these investments. Sure, I don't like this idea of them investing down there, but I don't think it should be dealt with by intimidation and threats like we just read. And if you don't do it, you're going to get this. I think this threat of a tax, because they're in the middle of doing something, they made a decision based on the current law that they're going to change the law right in the middle. I think that's an ex post facto law. I think it should be unconstitutional to do that, but it's great grandstanding and it looks good. But quite frankly, I don't think that's what's going to bring jobs back. I think maybe jobs will come back a little bit or fewer will go out, but they still have the business cycle to deal with. The downturn is going to be vicious, and that'll be the big issue. Then the big thing will be who gets bailed out and who's going to get lined up. And then once again, it's this combination of big business and big corporations that I think is the big problem. And this sort of adds fuel to the fire, I think, what's happening today.
And you mentioned how this plays with the crowds, and of course it plays well, and I think Trump capitalized on that tremendously well. The other one is Ford. Trump would go to some of these big rallies, and he would castigate Ford because Ford also had plans to build a factory down in Mexico. And I think we have a Ford tweet, too. He tweets about everything. And so he went, and this sold well. But Ford decided apparently recently that they would not build the plant in Mexico. And here he is kind of grandstanding and taking credit for it. But the interesting thing is they've decided now to spend $700 million building a new plant in Michigan, fixing up a plant in Michigan. But the economics on car sales aren't great. They had to idle a factory in Flat Rock for a week because people weren't buying Mustangs. They're just building too many of them. And so they're going to put $700 million into this plant in Michigan instead of Mexico, but they're going to build electric cars and self-driving cars. How do we know if that's what the market really wants?
All they're doing is compounding the inability for them to anticipate the market, and all the malinvestment is going to come. They're canceling a $1.6 billion deal and then making them do something that probably isn't the wise thing. The corporation is responsible for providing a good product at the best price to make profits to deal with their stockholders. That's the moral responsibility they have. They don't have a moral responsibility to say that what we have to do, the whole thing has to be for the corporate officers to make $10 billion a year. That can't be their goal, and it won't work. And it can't be, artificial wages. Right now, how are they going to compensate for this? You can get work in Mexico, and this is what really aggravates people. Yeah. The same job is $10 an hour, and if you go to Michigan or other places, it's like $30 an hour, and that makes it difficult mathematics, but there's artificial pressures on labor markets here too, and just like the minimum wage. I mean, that's not a market wage, but politically, you just can't even talk about that. It sounds like you don't care, but the people who should care are the ones who are looking at this economy now and seeing it as a consequence, not of free markets. It's a consequence of this management. And I think this is what we're dealing with, too, with the NAFTA thing. And, of course, we've been opposed to NAFTA. Matter of fact, I had the opportunity after it was in effect for 5 years, you had a chance to repeal it. So I got a coalition of liberal Democrats and conservatives. Of course, we didn't win the vote, but we were able to call it up again because I don't like international managed trade. But everybody else that doesn't like it for different reasons. Trump doesn't like it because he's not in control of things and he can't, dictate what people can do and what tariffs should be. Right now, the WTO is going to object to this. But there's another option, and that's free markets, where you don't threaten people with taxes and tariffs and regulations and all. But right now, what I wished is that the new administration would concentrate on lowering taxes, getting rid of regulations, and trying to get away from this monetary system where you have huge debt. That's not going to happen. The deficit's going to be there, bigger than ever. And it's going to require the Fed to monetize these debts, and it's just going to compound our problems. And it's going to be much bigger than, 5,000 jobs here, 5,000 jobs there. More mismanagement won't do it. So it's interesting that we have the populists. Those were the ones that joined us in Washington because there were more populists opposed to NAFTA than there were free market people. But it's the free market that we need. Matter of fact, the executive branch isn't even supposed to be dealing, in tariffs and all. And here it's just assumed, presidents have all this power, but that's a congressional function. Now, Trump does mention bilateral agreements. That is true, but it's up to the Congress to have the bilateral agreements. Let's have no tariffs and no impediments to trade with Canada. Congress passes the law, and with the condition, if Canada's agreed to it, that's all that's necessary. You don't have to have, or NAFTA, or give more power to the president. You don't have to intimidate and say, do it our way, or you're going to get a 35% tax on here. That is very disruptive and I think very dangerous.
And I think that really is our message. We talked earlier about, I think one of the questions on Ask Ron Paul, how is a libertarian to navigate these waters with the new administration? I think you pointed out perfectly now. On one hand, you have global managed trade, which we oppose. On the other hand, you have strong-arm protectionist populism. But there is another choice. There is another idea that
the free market.
Yeah.
And the other thing that it's hard for people to understand because they think you're anti something. But the markets, if you like markets, if you like freedom, if you like liberty, if you like private contracts, it ends up serving consumers. Consumers drive things. Every penny they spend is a message to the producers on what to do. And once you interfere in that, the business people get the wrong information, just like the interest rates give you the wrong information. But they're not designed to subsidize artificially high wages, and they're not designed to make sure big business has profits. And so often, there are, some company, it was not fair. This company's making this one isn't. So we have to crack down, and we have these laws that says that you can't have a certain percentage of the business, and they try to redistribute things, and it's not done. If you allow this principle that the consumer drives the economy, you're going to have a much fairer type of economy and a much more prosperous economy, and you will have minimal amount of government involvement. It wouldn't be that they're engaged in every single thing we do. So I'm really pretty concerned about the trend that we have moving in the direction of super corporatism and corporations rolling over because the government has the power. I'm going to take away your contract. You're not going to, General Motors, you're not going to just sell. We own you anyway. We bailed you out. We're not going to let you sell any trucks to the military. In the same way with Ford. And there's so many, Department of Homeland Security. They can say, well, don't buy from this company, buy from that company. And that's what they do in the military-industrial complex, the whole time. So it's a system that is a natural consequence of this model that we have been following for nearly 100 years of interventionism, inflationism, deficit financing, special interests, privileged groups, taking care of, entitlements for the poor and super entitlements for the rich, and take care of the financial system and drive everybody into the system. And if you're for freedom, just like Obamacare was the most atrocious part of was there was no option to get out. Everybody was going to be dragged down by being forced into it. So that is a problem that I think can only be solved philosophically.
And there is a better way to bring the jobs back.
Right. And I don't think management is the problem. They're mismanaging it. But when you have a system like this that depends on bureaucrats and politicians managing things, don't expect any good results. You need a different philosophy. You need a philosophy of private property, individual liberty, ownership of property and free trade, and also contracts. You got to fulfill your contracts. They're very, very strict laws that are placed there. If you follow those, instead of having thousands and thousands of pages of regulations and taxes coming out our ears. And what do we have proposed here to solve all this problem? You do it my way, or I'll put a 35% tax on what you're doing, or we'll put you out of business. That's wrong. I vote for the free market. I vote for individual liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. Please come back soon.
Ron Paul Liberty Report, RonPaulLibertyReport.com, and Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube. Check them out. Subscribe. Now, for some reason, it seems like I have a little static on my end. Don't know if you guys are hearing it. Hopefully not. Okay. Now, it's one thing to want to have plenty of jobs here, too. It's another thing to punish low-income people to try to bring those jobs back. I understand the theory through it because I used to believe in it. But in reality, it just does not work out that way. And that's one of the things that does not get addressed enough is really the education behind the free market, and definitely in situations like this, why the tariff will not help the situation. It possibly will make it worse. But, another thing brought up too was, the monetary policy. And we have the Fed that just decides to do whatever it wants with interest rates. Artificially keep them low, and then the economy doesn't get better and raise them. Well, when the market was bad, lowering interest rates is not what you would want to do. You're like, yeah, because, well, you would have to do it. The economy's worse, so people can't afford. Hold on, the housing bubble happened because people already couldn't afford. And then when the economy sunk, those interest rates, you want to drop them down to zero. You just can't do that. That's the problem. The free market needs to be in charge of interest rates. When the market crashed, Ron Paul has talked about this, others have talked about it. When the market crashed, it was basically it's the free market trying to, fight through and fix itself from the artificial, interest rates. We want more people in housing, and then people are losing their houses because people that can't afford these homes are getting loans that they can't afford. Out of the Hill.com, audit the Fed bill gets new push under Trump. Controversial legislation to subject the Federal Reserve's monetary policy powers to outside scrutiny is getting new life in Washington. Representative Thomas Massey from Kentucky and Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. Rand Paul audit the Fed bill, gets new push under Trump. Trump plans executive actions for Obamacare repeal. Says the showdown have reintroduced legislation to audit the Fed after a similar effort stalled in the last Congress, but such a proposal, which has been vocally opposed by the Federal Reserve Chairwoman Janet Yellen, may face its best odds ever of becoming law. Both chambers are controlled by Republicans, long critical of the Fed's policies, and President-elect Donald Trump. House passes bill to overturn midnight regulations. Sorry, this article popping up on my phone throws everything around. And Paul specifically mentioned Trump in a statement about the bill Wednesday, making clear the measure's proponents believe they have an ally in their cause coming to the White House. The U.S. House has responded to the American people by passing Audit the Fed multiple times, and President-elect Trump has stated his support for Audit the Fed. Let's send him the bill, this Congress, said Paul. Under the bill, the Fed's monetary policy deliberations could be subject to outside review by the Government Accountability Office. Proponents of the measure argue that the Fed is too powerful and lacks sufficient oversight for its interest rate decisions, but Fed officials from Yellen on down, as well as other critics, have warned that such a policy could subject the Fed to undue political pressure and discourage it from taking unpopular steps for the good of the overall economy. Again, they're trying to control the economy. You can't control an economy that is naturally supposed to be a free market economy. The proposal has garnered some bipartisan support and has passed the House several times in past Congress, but the measure has typically stalled in the Senate. Senate Democrats refused to bring up the bill for consideration when they controlled the chamber, and senators rejected the bill in 2016 after it was brought up by the new GOP majority. Two non-Republican senators, Bernie Sanders, and Tammy Baldwin, sorry, again, this is jumping around. You can read the rest of the article at the Hill. Out of the Fed bill gets new push. Again, it has passed the House multiple times, but every time it seems to get to the Senate, it stalls out. And hopefully we can get something like this pushed through. And then let's see if Trump actually signs it. Let's see if he's going to hold true to that. Or will he feel the pressure from the owners of the Fed, the elitists, and buckle? I think we're just probably going to have to wait to see if it even gets through the Senate first. And who knows, it could even stall out in the House. We don't know. Sorry. Now, something else that, when it comes to the economy that is not free market is a minimum wage. And this idea that you can have this universal minimum wage and that'll fix everything and we'll raise it, the argument has been shot down so many times, and it really, I just don't see how people can still make the argument, because they go, well, I want $15 an hour. Okay, now that hamburger costs more. That means that people that buy that want paid more for they can still afford their hamburger, which means whatever they are making or servicing or, filing or typing or whatever they do ends up costing more. So time you get your $15 an hour minimum wage hike and everybody above you gets a raise, guess what? The money that you get every week will buy you exactly the same things you get now. And a lot of times in the process, people get fired, laid off, and replaced by machinery. And with our tech age the way it is, it can happen overnight. They literally could lay off millions of people if they wanted to. Let's get a crap load of, of these machines built. We'll send them to every store, and on a certain date, they'll, be turned on, and, we'll cut 3 employees or 2 employees from every single store. I have a short clip here from Stefan Molyneux. What pisses me off about universal basic income. I want to cover a little bit of this.
On you from Free Domain Radio. Hope you're doing well. So an idea that is returning like a bladed boomerang is this question of, or the argument for, a universal basic income, or UBI. It has been experimented on in the past, in the 60s and 70s. It's coming back to my home province of Ontario. It was recently rejected by 3/4 of Swedish voters this summer. And the idea basically is that this complicated alphabet soup of benefits provided by the government for people who are poor or disabled or single moms or whatever, well, it's too much of a mess. It's too much overhead. And there is the problem of the welfare cliff, which is where you lose benefits by increasing your income, to the point where the actual tax rate, sort of quote tax rate, for increasing your income if you're poor can be actually over 100%. In other words, you get a raise, you end up with less take-home money and or benefits. So this is a big giant mess. So what we need to do is sweep all of that bureaucracy away and just have a simple universal basic income. And this will deal with the problem, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, of automation, that the robots are going to be taking all of our jobs. And therefore, we're going to have so much wealth because of automation that we can just afford to hand out this money to everyone. So this is not... the universal basic income is truly universal. It doesn't matter if you make $1 billion a year or $1 a year, you get a certain amount of money. Now, the challenge, of course, is that if the benefit is fairly small, then it's quite affordable, but it doesn't really change behavior that much. It's not enough to live on. If it's large enough to live on, then the implications for the tax system are pretty large, and you could argue that it's too large to pay for. It is an old idea and has been advocated for by a wide variety of people. Thomas Paine, ancient pamphletist, argued in 1797 that the government ought to pay everyone £15 per year. Boy, that's back when money actually meant something, eh? And they would give this £15 a year in exchange for a social consensus that private property rights ought to be defended. A little bit of a contradiction there, saying, well, we'll steal from money and give money to you so that you'll support a respect for property rights. Well, that's just a little bit too twisty for me. So just looking at the U.S., we'll chew through a few numbers and see if we can make any sense of it. Let's just say kind of a bare minimum, a basic income of, say, $1,000 a month. So, $12,000 a year, not really quite enough to live on, I guess, after you're no longer a student. At just a smidge or two above the poverty line for a single person, so $12,000 a year. Now, about 242 million adults living in the US. 7% of them are non-citizens. And let's just say the money only goes to citizens. So we got 225 million adults times 12,000 a year. That's, well, just a little over $2.7 trillion, or about 70% of the current federal budget. So on the cost side, we are talking about $2.7 trillion. Now, even if you get rid of things like temporary assistance for needy families or welfare, unemployment insurance, Social Security, food stamps, and all that, well, the government is only spending about $1.2 trillion on those particular programs. Now, if you give people $12,000 a year, it's going to be less than the money that a lot of the people are getting from the welfare state as it stands. So you either have to increase it just for those groups, or you have to increase it as a whole. And so you're going to end up, a $3 trillion or a $4 trillion program, which replaces $1.2 trillion of current welfare spending. So that's quite expensive when you think about it. So what do you do? Well, the way that governments do these things in general is they will either raise taxes. Let's say they raise taxes. So they raise taxes on the wealthy, of course, because there's not much point giving people money and then taxing it back. Even as a government program, that's too obviously useless. So you raise taxes on the wealthy and on corporations and all that. Okay. Well, what happens is when a corporation's taxes go up, they don't have this big magic pile of money to pay it with ad infinitum. So what they do is it drives up the price of their goods, right? They have to pay more in taxes, so they have to charge more in goods. So you give people $12,000 a year, you raise taxes on a lot of other people to pay for it, and that drives up the prices. And so you give them $12,000 a year, but prices go up to the point where pretty soon it's only worth $10,000 a year or $8,000 a year, and so on and so on. And therefore, you have to increase your universal basic income to keep it in pace with the inflation that's being driven by all the tax increases. And then, of course, to pay for the increase to your UBI, you have to increase taxes more. And that further devalues the UBI because it drives up inflation. Anyway, you get the idea. This is a cycle with no particular end. The same thing happens, of course, if you print the money to pay for the UBI. Inflation actually refers to creating more money out of thin air, unlike gold or Bitcoin, which are limited by physics and mathematics. So you can create lots of money out of thin air and pretend to pay for the UBI. That drives up inflation as well. And therefore, the UBI is worth less. So you have to increase it to pay for that. You have to print more money. You understand. You can't square this circle. And that's kind of how it works. Now, what governments really like to do, of course, is to borrow or sell bonds, which is sort of the promise of future payment to pay for current stuff. That, of course, does bring a lot of money into the economy that otherwise may not be there, which is also going to drive inflation. And, of course, it just defers the problem down the road. So it's really, really tough to find out some kind of way to pay for it. So then what you might say is, because, the people would say, oh, a billionaire is getting $12,000 a year in universal basic income. That makes no sense. He already has more than enough money. So then what you have to do is you have to start saying, okay, well, if you're above a certain income, we're not going to give you UBI. And then you basically have just ended up with a welfare state again and all of the problems with that. So it's really, really hard to find a way that any of this stuff could conceivably work in long-term practice. In short-term, sure, you can print a bunch of money, you can pretend to pay people a lot of money, and for a year or two, inflation often takes sort of 18 months to show up when you increase the money supply or raise taxes or whatever. So, well, that's you can make it work for a short amount of time. In the long time, it's a big problem. It's also interesting how it might affect something like immigration. So will taxpayers like sending money to immigrants? You set foot and you get your residency of some kind in some country, and immediately you qualify for this $12,000 a year or whatever it's going to be. And are people going to feel that that's a good use of their money? Are they going to feel like it's worthwhile? I would imagine not. There does seem to be a bit of a nationalist wave sweeping through the West, and I think that would be a big problem. Now, one of the arguments, of course, for the universal basic income is those robots are going to take our jobs. And now this has been a kind of staple or cliche of science fiction fears for decades, if not longer. And there was a 2013 paper. It was written about quite a lot online and in print. Two Oxford economists said, well, 47% of all U.S. jobs were at risk of computerization. And 46% of those, of course, were Marco Rubio. Boom! But so almost half of U.S. jobs were at risk of computerization. So let's say that there's some validity to that. And of course, as minimum wage demands go up and up and up, you go to McDonald's and now there's a automated kiosk rather than somebody taking your order. So people are going to be thrown out of work. It's not just because of automation. It's because of complex regulations. It's because of unions. It's because of lawsuits. It's because of minimum wages. It's because of all of this kind of crazy stuff. And also, Western educational systems have become pretty terrible, which means that as an employer, you're kind of getting brain-wrecked, indoctrinated people whose childhood dreams and rationality has been crushed into pulpy brain orange juice because of terrible educational standards. And so it drives up demands for robots when human beings become ungodly expensive because of regulations and a lack of tort reform, and also because they're just not as reliable and as competent because they've been raised badly in general. So, particularly by the schools. If you can imagine a private voluntary educational system, parents would know that there's this risk of automation or computerization in the future. So they'd sit down with whoever was trying to offer them the school services, and they'd say, okay, well, how are you going to prepare my kid for an increasingly automated world, right? So when the economy shifts, and you can see it coming, and this one is not going to be a sudden event. You can see this coming many years down the future. Well, parents would be asking how the school is going to prepare their kids for that. Of course, with government schools where you're forced to pay and often forced to send your kids there, and it doesn't matter what you want, they don't have to respond to these market forces. So this is sort of another example of one terrible government program giving rise to the need for another terrible government program. Government schools are not adapting to the modern economy very well, if at all, and therefore you need universal basic income because schools are spitting out people who have negative economic value relative to robots. And, given all we're capable of as human beings, it seems a little tough that we can't find any way to give kids economic value greater than a robot. And social resentment is not inconsequential as well. Like if you get two people, next door to each other, right, and one is getting up and going to work, and let's say they're both healthy or whatever, one is getting up and going to work, and the other one is staying home and binging on Netflix and doing whatever, and maybe not as high a standard of living, not making as much money. Aren't you going to feel if you're kind of getting up early and shaving and going to work and fighting traffic and bad weather and so on, are you going to feel at some point that you're kind of being ripped off a little bit? The other person's kind of sitting around and you're going through paying for them. And at some point, it's going to feel like, hey, why bother? And that, I think, is important. One of the great mistakes that's made with government programs is you say, well, only 10% of people are poor. And so we'll just take a little bit of money from the wealthier people and we'll give it to the poor people. And lo and behold, we will eliminate poverty. But of course, by transferring money from richer people to poor people, you change the decisions of both richer people and poor people. It's called public choice theory. And it's a really fascinating thing to sort of understand the dynamic nature of human society. That if you say, well, we're going to take money from wealthy people, give it to poorer people, then it becomes more valuable to become poor and less valuable to become wealthier. And if you tie that into, kids need food and so on, and therefore, we're going to take money from people who don't have kids fundamentally and give it to people who do have kids, particularly if they don't have any income or they don't have a marriage, or they don't have a provider and so on. Well, you're taking money from more responsible people and giving it to less responsible people to breed. And you understand, this is kind of how it all works. It changes. Everything you touch with government money, with incentives and all of that, changes. And so I think there would be a lot of resentment that came out of this sort of universal basic income in a way that doesn't happen as much with something like a disability, because you have to go through some process to say, a doctor's got to certify, I think, that you can't hold down a job. And so there's a sense that it's more legitimate than just handing out money, so to speak, like candy. So, yeah, governments couldn't possibly afford it. It would end up most likely being means tested. And what that means, of course, when something becomes means tested, let's say that you say, well, everyone who's making less than $12,000 now is going to be given $12,000. Let's just say you make up some rule. and you say, well, there's only a few percentage of people who are making less than $12,000, so here's how much it's going to cost. But it makes no sense at all, because let's say you make $13,000. And if you make $12,000 or less, you get free $12,000. And if you make $13,000, you get nothing. Well, what that means is that your income has just been slashed enormously, because you're now working the whole year, not for $13,000, but for $1,000, which is the difference between the $12,000 and the $13,000. So if you quit your job, it only costs you $1,000 if you're making $13,000, and then you get the $12K from the UBI. If you quit your job, it only costs you $1,000, and you get all of this free time and all of this, wonderful stuff. And this sort of goes up and up and up. So what happens, of course, is that people who are close to that line will then drop down into that line. And that means that vastly more people will end up needing universal basic income if it's got an income cap than would otherwise have needed it beforehand. And so then what happens is, you can say, well, we're going to raise the UBI so that fewer people have an incentive to drop down in their salary. But of course, what that means is, let's say you make the UBI 15. Okay, well, now the 13,000 guy definitely won't keep his job, because he's making minus $2,000 by getting up and going to work. And usually when you get paid low wages, you're not usually having a great time at your work. It's usually not a huge amount of fun. So that doesn't work. And then all the people at $20,000 look at the $15,000 one and say, okay, well, if I quit, I get all this free time, and I only lose $5,000. In other words, me working full-time only makes me $5,000 a year, so they'll drop down, so fewer people will be paying taxes and all this kind of stuff. So it's a big, giant mess. The moment you touch incentives, this problem arises. Now, this is a well-known problem among private charities, and private charities work very hard to support people without enabling them, to help them during temporary emergencies without creating the Roach Motel endless quicksand, gluey, sticky trap of the current welfare state. Like, once you get caught in the welfare state, it's almost impossible to get out in terms of rational calculation, because as you make more money, you lose benefits. And it's like trying to climb an escalator in slow motion. You're trying to get up, but you just keep going further down in your income. And then you end up having to make like $60,000 or $70,000 before you match what you're getting, especially if you're a single mom with kids, before you match what you're getting just by being on the welfare state. So private charities know that that's a big problem, that you want to help the deserving poor, right? The people who are poor, through no basic fault of their own, sort of bad luck, bad circumstances, and so on. You want to help those people, but you don't really want to help people who are milking the system or who have made really bad mistakes or really bad decisions. You don't want to sort of reward that. So you'll give them very conditional help. You'll give them very limited help. And the help won't just be financial. It will be, helping them figure out how to get and keep a job. It will be helping them over addiction problems. There'll be lots of things to do with actually helping the person in terms of the root cause of poverty. And the root cause of poverty is not necessarily just a lack of money. That's an effect. It could be a variety of other dysfunctions that are causing the behavior that results in poverty. And of course, the government can't do that. Someone in a bureaucracy mailing out a check, they don't know the individual circumstances. So private charities are very effective at helping people overcome poverty and get out of poverty, because charity programs are privately funded to the degree with which they prevent and alleviate poverty in real time, whereas government programs are funded by force, and there's no requirement that they reduce the number of people who are poor. And of course, governments, particularly on the left, kind of like a lot of poor people, are being dependent on the state, because that means they'll always vote for more and more government and more bigger government. People who are on welfare have very little problem voting for increased taxes because those taxes don't affect them because they don't pay taxes in general, other than maybe some sales tax. So income taxes, no problem. The more people who are working and paying income taxes, the more pushback there is against increasing income taxes. So the governments love having, leftist governments in particular, love having people dependent on the government. They can jack up taxes and they can be guaranteed of votes for larger and larger government, because that's the host that the people are currently feeding off. So as far as universal basic income goes, yes, it is a terrible idea. Morally, of course, it requires the initiation of the use of force to shovel money around from one group to another, or in this case, it would probably be, I guess in terms of inflation, you'd be shoveling money from those with savings to those without savings, or from the future unborn people who'll have to pay off the government debt to people in the present. So it's immoral in its fundamentals, and it's impractical in its economics. So I just really wanted to get that idea out there because I know it's floating around. And so I hope that you'll find this interesting. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. And please don't forget to go to freedomainradio.com/donate to help us out with this show and all the good that we're doing in the world. Thank you.
Stefan Molyneux on YouTube. Check him out. Subscribe. And he's someone that I often find myself disagreeing with. But on this issue, you know, he points out many of the things that I've already pointed out. He might put it in a little bit better way. You know, it seems like it's a constant cycle that you think after doing it this many years, you think we would learn. We keep raising minimum wage. This has nothing to do with a healthy economy. We have to make it where the large corporations can't use government to make rules and regulations basically to sandbag smaller companies from ever becoming competitors. And this method is, you know, the same method that JP Morgan, Rockefellers, all used to create the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was basically the top banks' ways. They go, you know what? We already compete with each other. Now we got these little guys trying to come up behind us and, you know, knock us off guard. And, you know, we're the top dogs. We all respect each other. I got an idea. Let's form a private bank. And we got all these buddies, you know, in Washington. Let's get them to pass a bill to put the currency in the hands of the Federal Reserve. Then we can make monetary policy too. And then we can prevent any of these big banks from ever becoming a competitor because they'll have to answer to us. Now it should make more sense why the banks got bailed out. That should, in itself, explain a lot. But for some reason, we still have a large swath of society that knows nothing about the Federal Reserve, nothing about how it was created or what it does or any of that. They just want $15 an hour to take your money at McDonald's. And this is already affecting companies elsewhere. Because even though, which I've seen this, a lot of McDonald's have grown adults working at McDonald's. But some companies are still, you know, where McDonald's used to be, where it was high school and college kids running McDonald's. They were in there flipping the burgers, taking the money. They were working their way up to college or working their way through college to then get a job that can sustain a adult, you know, a family, you know, not the teenager in their mom's basement. But there's still companies that hire high school kids. Hey. Now those companies in certain states that have already raised their minimum wage to $11 an hour are going, I'm now having to pay the high school, kids what I pay, a new guy that has experience, until they're hired in, actually hired in, um, the probationary period at the beginning. But once they get hired in, of course they go to a little bit higher wage, but now you're basically wanting me to pay the high school kids I hire to come in and, sweep the floors and do the little stuff, wages that you say you are raising for a living wage for a adult that might have a child. And again, that goes back to what? The economy. If we're going to bring up our economy, we have to get rid of regulations, I think, is number one. But the problem is, what regulations are they going to propose to get rid of? Usually what happens when they go, hey, we'll get rid of regulations, they don't get rid of regulations that help the mom and pop store, the small business, or the person that wants to start a small business. It tends to always help the large corporations out. Because again, the big corporations are the ones with the lobbyists and they're doing their bidding for them. The mom and pop store doesn't have their own lobby to go in there. So within the Beltway, you have a whole bunch of people influenced by lobbyists and big business. So even when they come up with the idea to help the little man, the people that are helping them come up with this plan, all their ideas come from the lobbyists. Well, let's ask, Walmart and, Target and Kmart, what regulations would help, the retail sales business? Well, you know what? I don't think Target, Walmart, and them are doing too bad. I don't think they really have a grasp on what regulations might help all of retail. They're already doing well. More than likely because of regulations passed that benefits them. Go to the mom and pop stores and ask what would help you be able to grow your business. What regulations can we get rid of? The small business owners will tell you. The large corporations will only tell you what will help them get rich while snuffing out the rest. Because that is how they became as big as they are. Ford at one time, couldn't squeeze in there. Then he became one. These are the mistakes that we've seen in history. And I've always been someone that I try to learn from my mistakes. But somehow, these people can't do that. They can't learn from their mistakes. They can't learn from other people's mistakes. And you know, I like to make the least amount of mistakes as possible. So I tend to try to, even learn from other people's mistakes. And it's really hard to even have a conversation with a lot of younger people because they have a very, very narrow view of society as a whole, really. Um, when I think I'm probably not the best example. I've always been a little bit different than most of the people around me. Tend to be why I always had older friends. You know, I had a friend pass away a few years ago. That's, my mom knew, my dad knew. Um, my Even though I'm young, a lot of my friends are in their late 40s, early 50s, mid 50s. The friend that passed away a few years ago was in his mid 50s. And when I try to talk to a lot of younger people, though, they really have no grasp on a lot of issues that when I was younger, I seen these things. I had not only they believe they have this world view, but they have a very straight like view on it, and it's hard to listen to some of the arguments they make because it's based off of false history. And I'm saying false history in the sense that there's multiple, you know, verifications that, you know, what you've been told didn't happen, but because what you've been told to believe came from someone at a university that has some type of ideological agenda, a lot of times socialism and communism, um, they are giving you a straight look on history that causes you to look through these like drunken goggles when you're looking at the world. And a lot of times we have to blame ourselves for some of that. But what we can do to fix that, I think, will have to start in the house. And if you decide to go, like, if you're going for liberal arts or something, I probably wouldn't worry about going to a college. But if you're going to be a engineer, architect, doctor, surgeon, pharmacist, whatever, maybe you want a little bit of knowledge before you go into that. But there's a lot of other things that are really, really easy to learn online. And I'm not saying online college, I'm saying free online. And there's a lot, even in a lot of the fields like architecture, being an engineer, a doctor, there's a lot of stuff you could learn before you even went to college. Free on the internet. And the reason why I say college is, they can have cadavers. You can, learn how to conduct surgery. You'll have people that, know what they're doing. A lot of times it also, they also intern out to the hospitals and stuff. we can get into the whole discussion on if what they're teaching is always legit when it comes to pharmaceuticals. But, you know, I do have a high respect for a lot of surgeons and stuff. Maybe not the pharmaceutical side of medicine, but definitely the, you know, surgical side of it. But we have to start in the household to, you know, self-educate. When we can start producing youth that can take on a full debate with a professor, because what the professor may be trying to teach and the agenda that they're trying to push doesn't, you know, hold up to facts, you shut down that whole agenda in the college system. You make the college system basically as credible as mainstream media is today. Okay, give me a second here. Now, when we look at what's going on in the stock markets right now, and then you look at things like gold and silver, which have kind of fluctuated but have gone down, and then you see what is going on with Bitcoin, and it's skyrocketing. Hopefully, there's some of you that maybe took my advice and bought just a little bit of Bitcoin, and it wasn't but too long ago that it was only around 250. Now we're seeing it up around, find my little mobile device here, and we'll give you a live update on what Bitcoin's sitting at right now. Maybe. I know gold and silver definitely have dropped considerably, but Bitcoin is sitting. Here we go. Right now, Bitcoin is sitting at 1129 and 50 cents. So 1,129 and 50 cents right now is what Bitcoin is trading at in U.S. currency. In the euro, it's trading at 1,068. But it's going up. Now, what I think is happening is what our stock market is doing is, again, it's artificial. It's not a actual fair representation of what is currently going on. And for that reason that the stock market is going up, it's artificially inflating the dollar again, which then in turn is dropping the price of gold and silver, which means it's a good time to buy gold and silver. What I believe what is going on with Bitcoin is, one, Bitcoin has become a very global, use of trading. And when you look at it at a global scale, you understand that, well, even though the U.S. stock markets are up, that their economy is not doing better. Therefore, this is artificial. What I think Bitcoin is doing is looking at, well, it's the the global market's collapsing. It might be a slow collapse. They might be trying to prop it up, but it's collapsing. So we're going to continue to go up. Now, they might be jumping a little ahead of themselves, too, on the price. But I believe they're not playing the artificial game where, like gold and silver right now, where it basically is artificially low because they're artificially inflating the US dollar. So right now, honestly, I wouldn't buy Bitcoin. I'd be buying gold and silver. For me personally, because I believe Bitcoin's a little bit higher than what it really should be. But what is, going on with this Bitcoin surge? I watched this interesting clip, and I was actually watching it while another clip was playing that I already watched earlier that I played for you guys. I had another one that came in from We Are Change that I was watching on my mobile device. But he was getting into Bitcoin, and since I was planning on talking about this Bitcoin skyrocketing up in the thousands, which I know some people that were buying it when it was down around 230 and 220, and I'm sure they are jumping up and down right now. But this We Are Change clip, Bitcoin surge explained and the future of cryptocurrencies. And I found this pretty interesting. So let's go ahead and dive into this.
Of wearechange.org. And as we are talking, Bitcoin prices are soaring right now, nearly as high as gold. To talk about this and a lot more, we have Jeff Berwick, the dollar vigilante, on with us to explain what the hell is happening here, what's going to happen in the future with Donald Trump, and also an amazing event that he's putting together in Acapulco, Mexico, called Anarchapulco, that myself and other amazing speakers will be speaking at. We're going to give promo codes at the end of this video to explain how you could get there and all the amazing workshops taking place there as well. Now, Jeff, how are you and what is happening here? I know you've been telling people to invest in Bitcoin when it was, what, $30? Now the people who listen to you must be extremely happy.
Yeah, it was actually $3 in 2011. That's when I first started covering it. And when I first found out about it, I was super excited. It's the first real free market money, aside from gold and silver, of course, but it's actually much more usable in today's digital age. And it can't be controlled by governments or central banks. So I began covering it immediately in 2011 at $3, made many millionaires for subscribers of the Dollar Vigilante. And of course, even last summer, I covered it very heavily when it was around $200. And I said, this is your second chance to buy into it. And it's been soaring ever since. Of course, 2 years ago it was about 200. About a year ago it was about 400. About 6 months ago it was about, or actually a month ago, it was about 800. It's now over 1,100, breaking all-time highs in every currency, actually every currency now, except for the U.S. dollar, which is just about to break, might even happen today. And it's really in reaction to what's going on with the central banks and the indebted governments around the world. The U.S. government is now just about to break $20 trillion in debt, going up massive amounts just constantly. Of course, we have Donald Trump just about to come in. That's causing a lot of confusion about what he might do, but he's definitely talking about spending more money. So the U.S. dollar will continue to collapse. All fiat currencies are collapsing. And we're seeing a war on cash going on. We're seeing India. You were there when they canceled pretty much all the money that people had. They just said it's not worth anything anymore, which is pretty much what all fiat currencies really are worth. It's just worth the piece of paper it's printed on. It's just a piece of paper with a dead criminal printed on it. I think we'll look back on this in 10 or 20 or 30 years and just be amazed and marvel that people used to think that was money. And so we've seen now Venezuela, which we were just at in March of this year. They did the same thing. They just canceled all the largest notes, which are the 100 Bolivar note, which is actually only worth about 10 cents now, or actually 2 cents, I believe. It was 10 cents when we were there. They just canceled that. So this is a move to actually get rid of cash and get everyone into the banking system now that all the governments are so indebted that they have to move to negative interest rates. So once they move into negative interest rates, obviously a lot of people will just take their money out of the bank. It's like, why would I keep my money in a bank if I'm losing 2% a year just by keeping it there? So they're trying to get rid of cash now, and this is what's causing a massive demand for Bitcoin.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of moves made in India and Venezuela that many people are speculating this is the real reason why the Bitcoin prices are going up. There's been a lot of speculation, and I think Donald Trump is definitely the wild card here. We don't know exactly what he will do with Bitcoin or how he will handle Bitcoin, but as we know, currency is really just faith. You know, what makes a dollar worth something is the faith in the dollar and the usage of it. And the more people that have faith in Bitcoin, the more people that use Bitcoin, obviously the price will go up. Is this what you attribute to the recent surge in the price that has been happening?
Yeah, there's so many reasons for it to rise. I've been saying since 2011 was $3 that it could hit a high, or not, it might never even be a high, but it could be as high as $1 million of Bitcoin in the next few years if all fiat currencies collapse, which is what I talk about at the Dollar Vigilante, which is why we're probably the largest financial newsletter in the world now, because we've been talking about this and warning people and getting people into gold, silver, and Bitcoin for years now. So there's many reasons why this is occurring at this moment in time. One reason, for example, is China has capital controls, and they allow each Chinese citizen or slave to take $50,000 outside of China every year. So usually on the first days of the year, everyone who has any money tries to get it out of China. But instead of going into things like other fiat currencies, which would be quite stupid, many Chinese, and you can just watch, you can go to fiatleak.com and watch how much money is flowing into Bitcoin from China right now. That's been, I think, the biggest spark in the last few weeks, because it's been up about 30 or 40% in the last couple of weeks. I think that's been the biggest reason, but there's no reason for it to stop at all. As you pointed out, it's all really demand and supply and a little bit of faith as well. And of course, the US dollar used to be tied to gold, and then they brought in the Federal Reserve in the horrible year of 1913 and brought in the Income Tax Act on the same year, and that's not a coincidence. And then the U.S. was essentially bankrupt by 1971, and that's when Richard Nixon took the gold backing completely away from the dollar, and it's been all downhill for the dollar since then. People say, oh, the dollar is up, but fiat currencies are never up. They're just up vis-a-vis other fiat currencies. Fiat government currencies are always being inflated. They're always going down in value. And so we're seeing just a lot of people waking up to what Bitcoin is. And as I mentioned, if we see these fiat currencies continue to collapse, and we absolutely will, you'll see more people going into Bitcoin. And because of that, governments and central banks around the world are absolutely panicking. And the beautiful thing about it is they can't stop it. They'd have to turn off the internet or turn off the power. And they actually do consider that. That's why there's things called the internet kill switch that they talk about all the time, because they're losing control of money. And when they lose control of money, they'll lose their power. And we'll actually go to a much more peaceful and prosperous time on Earth with no wars, and most people being much, much better off without the absolute rape of central bank inflation.
Very optimistic view. I definitely believe in that. But here in the United States, we're actually dealing with legal court cases, especially happening with Coinbase, with the United States trying to regulate it, trying to tax it. They're seeing all this money invested into this, and they're like, wait, hold on. We want some of this right here. And it's going to be interesting to see what's going to be happening with Donald Trump, how he's going to react to it. As we know, he just tweeted on November 20th that he has a good relationship with Chuck Schumer, and Chuck Schumer has been on a full all-out war against the dark web and cryptocurrencies and Bitcoins, and there's been massive moves on regulations, but we're still seeing the price rise up, even with these court cases, even with Chuck Schumer going against Bitcoin. Where do you see everything going in the future and unfolding, especially with the kind of economic moves that Donald Trump is making right now?
Well, even before Donald Trump was elected, he made a lot of comments that the internet needs to be censored or shut down to some extent. He's said that many times. That is exactly what's happening. You brought up on your own show many times about the fake news, which is, that's what the mainstream media is. That's what we've been saying for years. It's just propaganda and absolute fake news. But because people like yourself and so many others are actually getting out real information now, they're absolutely panicking. So that's why Barack Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize winner who's never had one day of peace in his entire presidency, put into the National Defense Authorization Act the essential fake news legislation, saying they're going to try to shut down anyone who's not saying what they're saying on CNN, which is absolute fake news. So they're losing control on every facet right now. This is going to be an amazing and unbelievable time. It's an amazing time in human history. They're losing all control of communication. People are actually able to get real information for first time worldwide in human history. The money is now becoming totally not controllable or regulatable or seizable, or you can't shut it down. There is no Bitcoin office. There is no Bitcoin CEO to arrest. There is no Bitcoin office for them to come in with their usual SWAT teams and start destroying computers. It actually exists in the cloud. So this is actually an amazing time in human history, and a lot of people don't necessarily realize that yet. But this is an absolute war between the people who have been controlling this world for hundreds of years and everyone else, all of us, the 99.999%, and we're actually winning right now, and they're in all-out panic mode.
Total panic mode that we've seen the whole brunt of with Facebook and YouTube and Google just trying to hit us as hard as they can, and they have on some levels. But I share the optimism with you because literally, even scientifically speaking, we are living on the best time in recorded human history. We have some ninnies online crying and moaning and bitching like, it's horrible. No, it's actually an amazing, beautiful time, and we're going to celebrate that time, definitely at Anarchapulco, which to me, and again, I've been to many conferences. This is the best one, mainly because it's in Mexico, and I love Mexico, and I love the Mexican people and the culture there and the beach and the weather. It's fascinating. It's beautiful and amazing. But we're going to be celebrating that at Anarchapulco, a conference that you're putting together. Really amazing speakers, really amazing workshops that we're going to be doing there. We're going to be doing that workshop as well. What's the latest on Anarchapulco, and why should people go there?
Well, it's the first anarcho-capitalist conference in the world, started in 2015. We're now in our third year, coming up the end of February, the last week of February. And it's really just a meeting of all the biggest minds and activists in freedom out there. So all the Bitcoin sort of related people will be there. And of course, I said that's a huge, massive change. You've got people even trying to decentralize the internet, people like MadeSafe and stuff like that. And you've got people like Rick Felfing, the Pirate Party. He's actually got freedom fighters, anarchists, voluntarists, they're all the same word, all in parliament in places like Iceland. It's half anarchists now, freedom fighters. So people actually trying to free humanity. They're all coming to this event. We've got so many people. You've come to it every year, Luke, you know, and you actually run your Change Media University, which is great. You almost always sell that out, and people say great things about it if you want to learn how to create your own media so we can get rid of this mainstream fake news media. But all the top speakers in the freedom movements are going to be there. Larkin Rose, Jeffrey Tucker, Adam Kokesh, Lauren Southern of Rebel Media, Roger Ver, the Bitcoin Jesus. It just goes on, and it's all in the last week of February in Acapulco. And the tagline for the conference is "Evacuate the state, brave the future." And the whole concept is that in order to change things, you can't actually change the system that much. What you can do is create new systems that make the old system obsolete. So that's things like the internet, things like Bitcoin. And now we're seeing what happens when you have these things. You actually just make it so you don't have to shut down the Federal Reserve or protest or say shut down the Federal Reserve. You basically just start using Bitcoin and just ignore the U.S. dollar and the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government, and they just go away automatically.
Exactly, because the solutions are within all of us. You're also going to be running an investment workshop also at Anarchapulco. I'm going to be running Change Media University, which is going to be like a life training, media, online, digital world kind of takeover, teaching people all my secrets of the trade to be online and have their voice heard. And people could use actually the promo code WeAreChange, WRC, when buying tickets or buying the workshops, and they get 10% off. Jeff, anything else you want to say about the future of Bitcoin, Anarchapulco? Any last words?
Just like I said, this is a time of an amazing change. To be around the people who are making these changes is just so fulfilling and so enjoyable. And there's literally hundreds and hundreds, might be up to 1,000 people this year at Anarchapulco, all trying to just change the system by changing themselves, as you pointed out, Luke. It's really about changing yourself and creating new systems that just make the old systems obsolete. We're in a time of incredible changes, incredibly optimistic, but as the old systems collapse, there's going to be a lot of craziness, a lot of chaos. But as long as you're informed and know what's going on, you can not only survive but prosper through it through things like owning Bitcoin.
Nice, Jeff. Thank you so much. That's Jeff Berwick of the Dollar Vigilante. His information will be in the description below. And once again, thank you again so much for watching, and especially the people who invested in Bitcoin early on. You guys are a lot happier now. Hope we were able to explain to you why this jump happened and the future of Bitcoin in this video. If we did so, click the like button. Thank you again so much for watching.
WeAreChange.org and We Are Change on YouTube. Check them out, subscribe, watch the videos. And that was also Jeff Berwick from the Dollar Vigilante. Check him out. Now, when we get to a point, which I believe eventually we will, where everything will be done without cash. I believe that within 20 years, you won't be able to take cash and buy things. Now, what they rather do is have everything ran through credit cards. Very highly regulated, and every bit of information that the government could ever want. Everything you bought, where you live. Shoot, they can even use it for, putting a map up of where you shop. With Bitcoin, you can have multiple wallets, encryption. Yeah, you can trace Bitcoin back to people if you try hard enough. But there's also ways to make it really, really, really difficult. Now people are like, well, what are you trying to hide? It's not about hiding anything. Many people don't remember something that happened. This was after the Boston Marathon event. There was a couple. And the man searched for bearings or something. I believe he was maybe working on his vehicle or a tractor. I can't remember exactly what the complete circumstance was, but he got on the internet, Google, searched for bearings or something. Well, later on, the wife needed a new pressure cooker. Hers was pretty bad, and she wanted to get a new one. So she decided, I'm going to look up, find me a new pressure cooker online. What does she do? She goes to what most people do, Googles it. Google give you prices and search results from, eBay, Amazon, a whole bunch of other, websites. So it makes it real easy to, search one place. Again, yeah, but then all your information's in one place. Well, husband searching for bearings, wife searching for a pressure cooker, invited the police raiding the house. I'm not sure if they raided it or they just, basically pulled them out of the house. But yeah, you could get, police showing up. So what if I go, hey, I want to go to Walmart. I'm at Walmart. I'm like, you know what? I need a new bearing for my boat trailer. So I buy a packet of bearings. You know what? My pressure cooker is going out. I'll go ahead and get one of those. Oh, matter of fact, I need to really take up my duct work too before, this winter. So might as well get a roll of duct tape too. Well, you're suspicious because you bought weird items. Might invite a guest to your door. Well, a lot of people are wanting to use Bitcoin to trade and do that. And definitely private exchanges can be done in Bitcoin pretty easy too. So, it's a way to circumvent, a controlled mechanism. Plus, even though it would be on credit cards, it would still be considered the U.S. dollar, central controlled, Federal Reserve. Not with Bitcoin. The market basically controls Bitcoin. And the funny thing is, some people went ahead and tried what they did in the past with the U.S. and our stock market and our economy. They try to manipulate it. And it was amazing to watch how quick Bitcoin corrected itself. No government intervention. The only thing that anybody intervened on was trying to manipulate it. Buy a crap load of Bitcoin, and I mean a crap load of Bitcoin, and then dump it on the market all at one time. Well, when they did it to the stock markets here in the U.S., it didn't bounce right back. Oh, no. Not only that, then it allowed politicians to push agendas that falsely are reported in our history as fixing the problem, when really, if you truly research it, it dragged out the problem. Not with Bitcoin. That doesn't mean that there's not a potential for failure with Bitcoin, but there's not as much manipulation going on with Bitcoin. Okay. Now, another thing I kind of want to talk about is what's going on with the U.S. overseas, especially Syria. What I'm hoping is that Trump will end all this, hostility, but I don't think it would actually happen. And we're supporting people that are not what the media is trying to say they are. And I've covered some of this and played some of the one reporter on the Ron Paul Liberty Report that was over in Syria and what's really going on. And this whole moderate rebels is almost like a slap in the face. But many people are believing, hey, there's moderate rebels over there. If there were, they're not there anymore. If they were there, they have been taken over by ISIS. I have a reality check, Ben Swan. I want to play. It's a pretty short clip. We'll go ahead and cue it up here. Reality check. Proof that those moderate rebels in Syria are really jihadists. So let's go ahead and cue that up.
A week ago, I told you that national media is not giving you the full story about what is happening in Syria. Specifically, that the Free Syrian Army and the so-called Syrian rebels, who have now lost control of eastern Aleppo, are not freedom fighters. They are, in fact, aligned with terror organizations. And while tens of thousands of you have voiced your support, some other media are asking me, where's the proof? Tonight, the proof in a reality check you won't see anywhere else. Well, as I told you, national media has framed the fight in Syria and for Aleppo as anti-Assad rebels against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. What they do not say is that throughout Syria, there are really only two groups fighting against Assad, ISIS and al-Qaeda. In fairness, that is a crude assessment. In reality, there are dozens of small militias and factions fighting Assad. The Free Syrian Army, it's always been made up of many different smaller groups. For the sake of explaining how jihadists are actually the ones fighting Assad, we're going to refer to the Free Syrian Army here as if it is one group. The Free Syrian Army was formed in July of 2011, but within just 1 year, there were already widespread reports that al-Qaeda in Syria had infiltrated. In 2012, I became the first reporter to question President Obama directly about the U.S. arming a group that had members of al-Qaeda. There's some concern about the U.S. funding the Syrian opposition when there are a lot of reports that al-Qaeda is kind of heading up that opposition. How do you justify the two?
Well, I share that concern, and so what we've done is to say we will provide non-lethal assistance to Syrian opposition leadership that are committed to a political transition, committed to an observance of human rights.
Well, while there were non-jihadist rebels in the original Free Syrian Army, they did not last long. 1 year later, in 2013, the CIA began delivering weapons to those Syrian rebels. The shipments began streaming into the country over the past 2 weeks, along with separate deliveries by the State Department of vehicles and other gear. A flow of material that marks a major escalation of the U.S. role in Syria's civil war. That was the Washington Post in 2013. But things only got worse because while the weapons were flowing in, well, so were jihadists. And by September of 2013, London-based global defense consultancy group IHS Janes reported that 10,000 of the estimated 100,000 insurgent fighters were linked to al-Qaeda. Another 30 to 35,000 belonged to powerful factions that were fighting for an Islamic State within a larger Middle East caliphate stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Now, in addition to that, that report showed at least a further 30,000 moderates belonging to groups that have an Islamic character. That means that by late 2013, only 25 to 30,000 so-called rebel fighters were part of secular nationalist groups. Again, that's 25 to 30% of the rebel force that could be considered friendly to the West. 70 to 75% of forces against Assad in 2013 were jihadists. But that didn't stop the U.S. from sending funding and sending weapons. And with some members of Congress, like Senator Rand Paul, insisting that these rebels were jihadists, by 2015, the U.S. committed $500 million to find and train moderate rebels. Instead, by September, a major blow, 3,000 of the few remaining FSA fighters, they defected from the organization. They proclaimed their allegiance to ISIS. Those fighters belong to multiple brigades that form the conglomeration of the FSA. Also in 2015, the Pentagon publicly admitted that an additional 70 U.S.-trained Syrian rebels surrendered a weapons stockpile to al-Nusra. Fighters from Division 30, they surrendered to the al-Qaeda affiliate group after crossing into Syria over the Turkish border. And as for that $500 million moderate rebel training program, that was halted a week later when the Pentagon admitted it had only trained 4 or 5 fighters. Not 400 or 4,000, 4 or 5. And it was in 2015 when the International Business Times reported that the moderate movement in Syria could be officially considered dead. As of last week, when the last U.S.-backed rebel faction disbanded its members, joining extremist groups such as the Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda offshoot in the country. Some of the men joined a group called the Levant Front, a coalition of rebel militias that also have ties to al-Qaeda. And again, that was 2015, and yet, through 2016, weapons and funding from the West continued. In September of this year, 2016, the U.S. delivered 3,000 tons of weapons and ammo to fighters in Syria, including rocket launchers and anti-tank guided weapon systems. So what you need to know, it is a fact that since 2012, those so-called moderate rebels in Syria have been absorbed into al-Qaeda groups or pledged allegiance to ISIS. And for the past year, the moderates, they have been gone. So when media only calls these groups freedom fighters, and yet these fighters have pledged themselves to Al-Qaeda and to ISIS, then no, make no mistake, they are not looking to make Syria free. They are looking to enslave it, as they have in so many other places. That's Reality Check. Let's talk about that on Twitter.
Ben Swan on YouTube. Subscribe, check him out. Now, the truth of the matter is, the U.S. involvement over there has one goal, and it's to overthrow Assad. We've known that the Obama administration has been up to this. We have known this, that there were plans that they wanted to go into Syria back in 2010. It didn't come out right away that we were already, shipping stuff to them. When we look at all the weapons that we are shipping all around the Middle East and how many countries have fallen and how many countries are under, ISIS control, it almost seems like to me that maybe Obama's trying to fulfill the caliphate, not ISIS. Because after Iraq, after Libya, after Egypt, a sensible person would go, we're only making it worse unless you have an agenda. I want to move on to something here before the end of the broadcast. Article from Jeffrey Tucker out of Foundation for Economic Education, FEE.org. FEE.org. And it's titled, "We Must Not Give Up Our Ideals." Let's go ahead. Get this pulled up all the way here. A government that fears technology, a regulatory board that suppresses invention, a ruling elite that fears people who break out of their own to learn things they shouldn't, a society that is growing ever poorer because the jackboot steps on every expression of individual entrepreneurial talent. The people are demoralized, dejected, depressed, hopeless. It all sounds uncomfortably familiar. The book in question is Ayn Rand's 1938 masterpiece, Anthem. It's my personal favorite of her books, even though it is far less known than her other works. She understood something about socialism that eluded many of her contemporaries and continues to confuse people today. Socialism and interventionism are never about progress. They force regression. This is because they stamp out creativity and individualism. A truly totalitarian world would not and could not be prosperous. It would be a world of grueling poverty. Rand understood because she had seen this with her own eyes as a little girl in Russia. The spectacular novel presents the stark reality in fictional form. Publishers reject the book. The author does not understand socialism. Read the letter from Macmillan in reply to the submission of the novella. They turned it down. Actually, the publisher didn't understand socialism. Hardly anyone did in 1937 when this book was written. Rand, however, did understand socialism, she understood it so well that she knew it would result in the opposite of what it promised, and that its proponents would eventually come to embrace its grim reality. Rather than repudiate the system of thought, in many ways, this book is one of the best dystopian novels ever written because it puts a central focus on the key failing of socialism, its opposition to progress. How is that possible given that progress is a central slogan in socialist thinking? The problem is that by collectivizing private property, socialism removes the machinery of progress itself. It abolishes prices and profits and calculation and the incentive to create. It puts a premium on political control. And politics resent the revolutionary implications of entrepreneurship. Therefore, a consistently socialist society would not only be poor and backward, it would revel in those features and call them the goal. Think about it. This book was written in the late 1930s, long before the environmental movement and long before the primitivist streak in socialist thinking was to emerge as an outright agenda to be imposed by force. But as a child in the old Soviet Union, Rand seen it in action. She had seen how entrepreneurship and creativity had to be sacrificed for the collective, and how this drove civilization straight into the ground. A totalitarian society would not be a world with amazing technology and flying cars, but would exist only at a subsistence level, and it would try to stay that way. Rand's world is our world. This is an excellent time to reread this book or encounter it for the first time. Every day, regulatory agencies are pouring out mandates that degrade our technology. They are degrading our washing machines, dishwashers, soaps, paint, light bulbs, toilets, water systems, lawnmowers, medicine, microwave showers, hot water heaters, gasoline, gas cans, and probably thousands of other things. These regulations are passed in the name of the environment and security. Their one result is to drive us back in time, making the future worse than the present and probably even worse than the past. And actually, just to point out one thing in that article, he talked about the gas cans. And, if you've tried the new gas cans, well, I've also seen people, because of how it chugs, if you try to tip it too fast, I've seen a lot of gas go on the ground because of these new gas cans. And it's kind of counterproductive, wouldn't you think? That's only the beginning. Through intellectual property laws, the state literally assign ownership to ideas that are the source of innovation, thereby restricting them and entangling entrepreneurs in endless litigation and confusion. Products are kept off the market. Firms that would come into existence do not. Profits that would be earned never appear. Intellectual property has institutionalized slow growth and landed the economy in a thicker of absurdity. So we finally come full circle in the land to which Rand immigrated because it was a free country. We've adopted features of the system she fled. In that case, this small book is an amazing critique of precisely the unfreeness of the system under which we increasingly live. in that sense, the dystopian world she presented is a distilled version of where we are headed to. Even the author's theory that the word I is the thing that is most feared by the regime has resonance. That is the way out. We cannot give up our ideals. We must have development, innovation, and progress because these are the sources of life, and we cannot give up life. Despite what all her detractors say, it is a fact that Rand was a genius and a visionary. The small book underscores that she saw things that no one else saw and saw them long before anyone else did. I think it even comes down to more understanding it before anybody else did. It's not that she saw all this happening, it's that she was realizing what was happening because she'd seen it before. And she was seeing the little pockets of it already popping up here in the United States when she was still alive. Because of what she went through in the old Soviet Union and coming here to America to get away from that and then to start seeing all of that, I think really drove her to be the author that she was, even though, that the left hates her. She really truly understood things in a way that they couldn't. And a lot of it comes down to not wanting to understand it that way. Because many of these people want to believe in this utopia. And I even seen it in the libertarian movement where during Ron Paul, they had this belief in this libertarian utopia. And it wasn't a big group of, it wasn't the majority of the people, but there was a decent amount of people that were, believing in a libertarian utopia, like it was going to be this amazing world. Well, the same goes for the people that, have been drawn to the socialist movement and the communist movement. People are drawn to this thing, all these types of ideologies, believing that there's a utopia. Now, if you actually look at libertarian philosophy, one of the philosophies that say, hey, there is no such thing as a utopia. These things will happen. But will you give someone the power and the immunity to fight those things and end up, committing the same atrocities in the name of fighting them? Are you willing to give people that authority and allow them to get away with, things? Because that's basically what we've done. We're not saying that under a libertarian society there would not be murder, there would not be rape, there would not be theft. We're saying that under this system there still is. But under this system, it's getting harder and harder for the individual to defend themselves. These are the realities, but I really try, but it's really hard to reach out to left, but we have to continue to try, definitely when it comes to the youth. Again, parents really look into this college thing if you got youth. Try to homeschool as much as possible, private school, try to stay away from public schools and a lot of these colleges. Or if they are going to go into these colleges for a career, make sure that they have very rooted principles and ideals that go along with freedom and liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. Thank you all. Stay tuned here on UCY.tv. And you know what? There's a great way you can help UCY.tv. If you go to UCY.tv, scroll down towards the bottom, you'll see a Amazon button. if you click that Amazon button, it takes you straight to Amazon through UCY.TV. You get the same great prices, same great shipping rate, and at the same time, UCY gets a little kickback from that to help cover operating costs. So, UCY partnered with Amazon to be able to, allow you to purchase the same things you already purchased on Amazon, but allow UCY to get a little kickback.